Welcome to the Monday Minute, our weekly video highlighting a useful way for your church to use technology. This week, we'll be creating and publishing a Faith Life newsletter to our church group. We'll begin on faithlife.com on our church group's page. This is where a congregation can gather between weekly services to view published sermons, engage in discussions, and read the bulletin. If you haven't already, it's a good idea to invite the whole church to this group so that they can become a part of your online worship community. Last week, we learned how to make a digital bulletin from start to finish. This week, we'll learn how to create an elegant newsletter. Let's begin by clicking on the Newsletters tab. Here we can see a list of all of our newsletter documents, published or in draft form. We'll take a look at this page in a moment. Right now, let's click Create Newsletter to get started. First, let's add a cover image to the bulletin. This could be our church's logo or an inspirational image that fits the theme of the newsletter. Next, we can add a header and subheader to our document. We want to make sure this section includes our church's name and the date. Now we're ready to start adding sections to our newsletter. There are 9 types of sections we can add on the right side of the editor. Sections can be dragged and dropped throughout a newsletter. Many of these sections integrate with the Faith Life features you already use, like the calendar events, the news feed, and the verse of the day. Let's try out one of these integrations to add an event to the newsletter. Notice we have a full list of our church's events that we can choose to add to the newsletter. Anything we check on this list will appear in the final newsletter that our congregants view. Let's add our weekly Bible study event and our service times for now. We can always add a separate list of events later in the newsletter for recreational activities like men's and women's breakfasts. We'll add a title to this section, and we're ready to move on. The next thing we want to do is embed last week's sermon into our newsletter by adding a news section. Each week when we record and publish a sermon in Proclaim, it's automatically added to the church group's news feed. Let's check the box for this week's sermon, but keep in mind that we can add multiple posts to a news section if we want to include more sermons or other posts. Anyone viewing the newsletter on their mobile device or computer will be able to watch the embedded sermon without leaving the page. Let's add another section to the newsletter. This time, we want to add a note to anyone willing to help volunteer to take down on Sunday, so let's add a text section. We'll add a header and our volunteer request, including contact info, in the request. Now that we've got the hang of adding and customizing sections, let's click Save at the top of the screen. We can always come back to our newsletter later to edit or update it, even after it's published. This newsletter hasn't been published yet, so it won't be visible to members of the church group who aren't administrators. Once our newsletter is ready to go public, we can click Publish on the top of the screen. Publishing a newsletter will send an email notification to all the members of your church group who have newsletter notifications enabled and show up in the activity feed in the top right. Let's go back to the documents list by clicking Done. If we want to reuse this template for future newsletters, we can open the options to the right of the newsletter and duplicate it. This is a great way to save time weekly or monthly. We can also see the number of people to whom the newsletter was sent, as well as the open rate. This is a great way to track the engagement of your congregation. Now let's have a look at the finished newsletter that's already been published by selecting it from the list. At the top of the newsletter, we've set our cover image to match our preaching theme on the cycle of redemption. Below this, we have a media section with a greeting message from the pastor, followed by the verse of the day. Upcoming services, as well as this month's reading plan, are included in the newsletter as event and text sections. Further down, we can see a group section, which can help direct our congregants to different subgroups, such as a youth group. After the previous week's sermon, there's a message asking for volunteers, followed at the bottom by the church's message and address. Tune in next week for a new Proclaim Monday Minute, and if you haven't already, go to proclaimonline.com/download to try Proclaim free for 30 days.